Plants, Lesson 7.3, Plant Growth. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about the basic things in order for plants to grow. However, when you think of things that plants need to grow, if you think back to our grade 2, grade 3 knowledge, you probably think of things like water, carbon dioxide, light, and then things like minerals and food. Well, those are absolutely correct. Plants do need those things to grow. However, as we'll learn later in this lesson, some of those things aren't necessarily needed for plants to actually grow. And plants can grow sometimes without these things. But basically, these are the things that plants need to grow. And it is very important for plants to get these things. So let's start off at the very bottom with soil. Soil and nutrients. So plants require nutrients to grow. That's something basic that we all understand. So these nutrients come from minerals and then they're absorbed through that soil. The soil usually it comes back from thousands and thousands of years ago, and it consists of things like sand, clay, tiny rock particles, minerals, and then humus in decaying amounts. And humus, not like the food hummus, but decaying plant or animal matter. So soil, when you let's say an animal dies in the woods somewhere and it decays over time. Well, eventually it decays into soil, which is that sort of top part to soil. And then eventually, if you start to dig down through soil, you get to like a more moist part of the soil, and then you actually hit hard, dead rock, which is like the bottom of the soil. But we'll talk about the parts of the soil in a second. So this brings us to layers of soil. So I've given you pictures of each individual part of soil. So imagine all of these different parts stacked on top of each other, starting with humus at the top. So it contains a leaf litter on the top, and remember, it's that animal and remains decaying part. It's often almost that part near the grass. Then we move to topsoil, which is just under the humus layer, and it supports plant growth. It contains humus, clay, minerals, and sand, and the roots start to penetrate through that part. Then we get to the subsoil, and it does not support plant growth well, so that's why you see the roots sort of stop going down there, but there are some tiny roots there. And then it sort of stops at this part because then there's no more sort of groundwater at this point, because it brings us to weathered rock, which does not support plant growth at all. Like, there's no roots there. You can see in that part it's just rocks on tops of rock, but it's still sort of soil-ish if you dig down deep enough, but it starts to get very hard there. And then it brings us to the bottom, bedrock, which would be like really, really hard to reach, but it's essentially like rock bottom, like just plain rock down there. So plant nutrients. So we've talked a lot about, plants need nutrients. Well, what kind of nutrients do it need? So it's classified as macronutrients, which are required in large amounts by the plants. So things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And then we have micronutrients, which are required in small quantities. So things like iron, zinc, or copper. And so these macronutrients and micronutrients are all found in the soil. Mostly macronutrients, and then sometimes micronutrients can affect different growths of the plant. And then you can also buy certain fertilizers, which we'll get to in a minute, of those micronutrients, which is actually really interesting. Now, let's talk about how the nitrogen actually works with the plants, because nitrogen is the most important one out of all those that we just talked about. So 80% of our atmosphere is actually made of nitrogen, but most plants can't take in nitrogen in its gas form. It must be absorbed from soil into the roots in the form of nitrate. Legumes have a specialized route allowing direct absorption of nitrogen gas from the atmosphere through something called nitrogen fixation. So what nitrogen fixation is the bacteria converting or fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere into something called nitrate, if you remember from chemistry, and ammonium compounds required by plants. They release what they don't need into the soil to be used by other plants. So that's why legumes are really important, because they go through something called nitrogen fixation. So now we can talk about fertilizers. So there are sort of two main types of fertilizers, organic and inorganic. So organic come from living sources that contain decaying plant or animal matters. So things like when we throw our compost away, like we throw our banana peels or our orange peels away, that's compost. Sheep manure is something that farmers often participate in, or then fish meal, which is something that typically fishermen take part in. And then inorganic fertilizers are actually produced chemically. So they're sometimes made in a factory or companies make them. So that's why it's not organic. It's not as natural as possible. And then they have 3 numbers on the label. So they have the percentage of nitrogen in the fertilizer, they have the percentage of phosphorus, and they have the percentage of potassium. So maybe your teacher will ask you to take a look at the chart that gives you these 3 numbers, and sort of the importance of these numbers is that, well, you don't want to have too much or too little of each one for your specific plant. So that's why you want to pay attention to the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in your specific fertilizer that you have bought. So now you've probably heard me say the word germination throughout this unit, but what is germination? So we talked about at the beginning of this lesson with things that plants need to grow. So we said plants need water, carbon dioxide, light, and minerals, and those are absolutely right. But what if I told you that you could make a plant grow without some of those things? So once a seed is released from the fruit, it begins to grow or germinate. Most seeds go through a period of dormancy before germination once they are released. So this is the interesting part. Seeds require oxygen along with heat and moisture from the soil to grow. Some also need light. So basically, the only things that your seeds need to grow are oxygen, heat, and some moisture. That's it. They don't even need soil. They don't even need soil. They only need oxygen, a little bit of heat, and moisture. Some don't even need light. You could grow a plant in a closet with no light, and we'll get to that in a minute, but yeah. And essentially what germination is it begins with the embryo releases gibberellin, which is a hormone, and we'll talk a lot about hormones later. This triggers the production of digestive enzymes. The enzymes then break down starch and give off energy. The seed coats often soften and crack under pressure, and now oxygen can flow into the seed and then therefore start the growth. And then the tip of the radicle emerges and grows fast. And I'll give you the different types of the plant. So we have the radicle, which grows and will form the root. We have the hypodicle, which emerges, forms a loop and hooks up and grows taller, encounters light, and then it straightens up and it becomes the lower part of the stems. And then we have the cotyledons, which are the seed, are dragged up by the hypodicle. And then, yeah, that's it. So you can see this diagram showing you all of those different parts of the seed and sort of how it grows up. Now, obviously, this is a super sped up version, but essentially that's what germination is. Now we have our zones of growth. So it breaks down into 3 sort of main ones. So meristematic zone, elongation zone, and maturation zone. So meristematic zone is where the cells divide both in direction of root base to form cells that will become the functional root, and the direction of the root apex to form the root cap. Then the elongation zone is where cells elongate very rapidly and undergo final round of divisions to form the endodermis. Remember, we talked about the endodermis and all those things like the Casparian strip. And then remember that it thickens to form that Casparian strip. And then the maturation zone is when the fully formed root with xylem and phloem will appear, and then the root hairs are the very first things to appear. So you can see that sort of yellow sticks poking out there. And those are essentially the zones of plant growth. So now that brings us to our final slide, try it at home. So sort of throughout this class biology, grade 11. We've never done to try it at home, but this would be a super cool thing if you wanted to try it at home. So what you're going to need is some bean seeds, some dried legumes, or just some dormant seeds in general, a small Ziploc, paper towel, water, tape, and a window. You don't necessarily need a window for this. I've seen people do it. They've tried to grow some seeds in the light and then some in the dark to see what happens, but we're going to do it the window way, just to give it that extra portion of the sunlight. So like I said before, seeds don't actually need soil to grow, and we picture plants growing, oh, we need to water them every day, but actually with this, they don't. You are going to germinate your own seeds, and all it needs is a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of water, and then in our case, some sunlight and a little bit of warmth. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your paper towel, and you're just going to maybe take a paper towel that has a crease down the center, or just take two paper towels, 2 strips of paper towel, and you're going to run that under some water just to get it wet. Don't make it dripping, soaking wet, just make it wet enough. Then you're going to take your dried legumes or whatever your seeds and sort of place them in that crease of the paper towel, and then fold it over to make it sort of just like a little bag for the legumes. You're going to take that sort of moist paper towel with the seeds inside and put it inside a Ziploc bag. You're going to take that Ziploc bag and maybe fill it just with a little bit more water, just like don't drench it at all, like just like a little bit more, just enough to make it a little bit more wet. And then you can go ahead and tape it up to the window. Make sure you don't close the Ziploc bag. You want to leave it open. So just tape maybe one of the sides to the window and then leave the actual bag open, because we want to make sure that oxygen can get inside, because that is one of the most important things for growing a plant. Now, you're going to have to wait a few days, but you're going to see that your plants are going to grow, and they're going to form all of those different parts that we talked about. So they're going to grow the radicle and the cotyledon, stuff like that. So you're going to have to see those, and you're going to see it's going to first start off with little roots growing, and then it's going to start to open up, and you may even start to get a sort of stem and growth like we saw in that video. So yeah, you can try this out. It may take a week or 2 weeks to grow. Make sure you're opening you're just taking a peek inside it daily, and then maybe every 1 or 2 days get some water, and just a little bit of water just to keep that Ziploc bag moist, and you should be good. And you can document it every day and see how your plants do, so you can germinate your own seeds at home. And that's it for this lesson on plant growth.